Today is about acknowledging the events of the last year and recognising the efforts of many across our society to advance respect for women. So, let's welcome our fabulous panel. Belinda Smith. Belinda is an Associate Professor of Law at the University of Sydney, researching anti-discrimination and labour law with a focus on gender equality, work and care. Her published work includes alternative regulatory tools and frameworks for promoting equality, and she's an active member of the Australian Discrimination Law Experts Group. Yvonne Weldon. Yvonne is the first ever Aboriginal person to run for Lord Mayor of Sydney. She is a proud Wiradjuri woman and a strong community leader who has spent the last 30 years fighting inequality and helping others deal with their traumas, including marginalised young people and survivors of domestic violence. Eleanor Campbell. Eleanor is a social worker and the coordinator of domestic and family violence counselling services at Bondi Beach Cottage, which is a not-for-profit community organisation based in Bondi, providing a range of family services. And last but not least, Licia Heath. Licia is the CEO of Women for Election Australia. Licia threw her own hat in the ring as an independent candidate in the 2018 Wentworth by-election and has since committed herself to increasing the number of women of all backgrounds and lived experience in public office at local, state and federal level. So, our format tonight will be Q&A. We have questions for each of our speakers to start us off, and then we'll move to the floor to take questions from you guys in the audience. But before we hear from our speakers, I wanted to reflect on the year that was. It has certainly been a big year for gender, politics, women's safety, equality and power. In January, Grace Tame, a sexual assault survivor and advocate for survivors, was named Australian of the Year. Now, we could easily spend the whole evening talking about Grace and the things that she has achieved this year. Suffice to say that she is an inspiration and is showing exemplary leadership on the national stage. In February, the National Plan to Reduce Violence Against Women and Their Children for 2010 to 2022 was released. Commonly known as the National Plan, the document is a 12-year plan to reduce violence against women by coordinating the work being done by all Australian governments via 4 3-year action plans. The day after the plan was released, a young Liberal Party staffer, Brittany Higgins, spoke out publicly about a rape allegation against a fellow staffer who is now awaiting trial. Her allegations were followed by name-calling, gaslighting, obfuscation and backgrounding by senior members of the federal government. Around the same time, Wentworth local Chanel Contos posted an Instagram poll asking young women if they had stories of being sexually assaulted while a school student. She has now received over 6,700 testimonies, and the poll has evolved into a petition calling for earlier and better sex education in schools with over 44,000 signatures. Chanel has helped shine a light on the need for better consent education in Australia and has inspired major changes in schools across the country. Indeed, the New South Wales Parliament has just passed affirmative consent laws this week. In March, the former Attorney General of Australia, Christian Porter, outed himself as the Cabinet Minister at the centre of an allegation of rape by a woman who had taken her own life the previous year. Mr. Porter strongly denied the allegation and attempted to sue the ABC for defamation over the story. Stories also emerged of sexualised bullying and harassment behaviour by Liberal and Labour Party staffers working within the Parliament. These events prompted the Women's March for Justice, which erupted across Australia, with thousands marching on Parliament House in Canberra demanding action to transform attitudes towards women in their homes, communities and workplaces. Many of us in the room tonight were there, and we were shocked to hear that whilst the Prime Minister of Australia failed to meet the protesters, he declared from inside the Parliament that it was a triumph of democracy that campaigners for women's justice were able to rally across Australia without being met with bullets. Outside, Brittany Higgins spoke to the crowds, stating that if democratically elected officials weren't committed to dealing with alleged abuses of power in their own offices, what confidence can the women of Australia have that they will be proactive in addressing this issue in the broader community? Following the March for Justice, the Australian Human Rights Commission commenced a review into Commonwealth parliamentary workplaces. Its aim is to ensure that the National Parliament reflects best practice in the prevention and response to bullying, sexual harassment and sexual assault, and that report is due out very shortly. The Morrison government also provided a limited response to the Sex Discrimination Commissioner Kate Jenkins' Respect at Work report. This was the product of the landmark national inquiry into sexual harassment in Australian workplaces and had been handed to the government several months earlier. In May, Mr Morrison announced a cabinet reshuffle, naming Senator Marise Payne as the Minister for Women and Amanda Stoker as the Assistant Minister for Women with a new Women's Safety Ministry. They also convened a Women's Safety Summit which took place in September. Social Justice Commissioner June Oscar and Professor Marcia Langton called out the failures to protect First Nations women and called for a dedicated, self-determined, stand-alone First Nations National Safety Plan to end violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. It is against this background that we are witnessing the rise of women stepping up into leadership roles on their own terms as political candidates, including as strong community-focused independents, with more female independent candidates being announced each month. Just today, LNP MP Bridget Archer bravely crossed the floor in Parliament to support a call for debate on the National Integrity Commission, which is something that we have been calling for very strongly here in Wentworth. We know there's a lot of support for that. Unfortunately, Dave Sharma, our local MP, did not vote to support debate, and it doesn't appear he was even in the chamber when the vote took place. As noted yesterday by Chief Executive for Women President Sam Mostyn in her National Press Club address, Goldman Sachs has found that bridging the difference between male and female employment rates alone would provide an 8% boost, or $114 billion per year, to the Australian economy. And Tim Reid, the President of the Business Council of Australia, has said that one of the largest productivity leakages in the Australian economy is the underutilisation of educated women. So that's just a very brief summary of some of the events of this year, and we can't possibly do justice to all of the women and our allies who have been speaking out, working hard and collaborating together to drive positive change. But what we do want to do this evening is focus on some of the very important political and social activities which are currently taking place around the country, and look at what we can do as members of our communities to help consign some of this appalling behaviour just referenced, including from senior elected representatives to history. So, Belinda, it's almost 40 years since the Sex Discrimination Act specifically prohibited sexual discrimination at work and established the role of the Sex Discrimination Commissioner. The current Commissioner, Kate Jenkins' Respect at Work report made 12 key recommendations for legislative reform, 6 of which were finally legislated by the government in September this year. Controversially, the new laws did not include any positive duty on employers to prevent sexual harassment, discrimination and victimisation at work. Can you tell us about the recommendations that have been legislated so far and what is happening with the remaining recommendations? Are they likely to be legislated by the government? And if so, when?
I would say the Respect at Work report did a number of things, and as Cass pointed out, it revealed particularly how pervasive, prevalent, persistent sexual harassment is in Australia across all manner of workplace and industry, and that the laws are inadequate. And the 2 key things about the laws that they recommended needed to change were some tinkering about the scope and coverage of the laws, but primarily the main problem with our discrimination laws that cover sexual harassment are that they are individual claims based. So they say no one's allowed to sexually harass anyone else in the workplace, but that is not enforced unless the victim, to use that term, brings a claim for an individual remedy, usually thrown in with a non-disclosure agreement, so it's all confidential and we don't hear about it. So the burden is almost entirely on individuals and to drive that change. So the key recommendations were to expand the coverage and to shift that so that the change was not all needing to be driven by individuals after the fact, but by organisations, primarily employers, to change the culture and seek to prevent the conduct. What we've seen in the laws so far is really the fiddling around on the first part, the expansion. Right? Not insignificant, welcome and so on, but just not enough, and we haven't seen anything yet on the prevention side. That's the big stuff. So what we saw in September with the amendments to the Sex Discrimination Act were an expansion of the coverage, fixing up some of the problems. They didn't cover state public servants. Right? The Sex Discrimination Act now does. They clarify that they also cover judges. Great. And members of parliament. Right? Expanded that. They also expanded coverage of workers, so it was quite narrow and tricky to work out, and now it's a much wider term, so it includes volunteers and interns and the full gamut of the different ways in which we work. So the coverage has been expanded, which is good. They've added a new kind of harassment, which is sex-based harassment, or a new action for that. They didn't come up with the concept. A new legal action, but again, even that's difficult to use and access because it requires a claimant to show that there has been seriously demeaning conduct. And then a few changes to the Fair Work Act. But what we really need to keep pressing for is the shift so that the burden is shared and it's towards a preventative system. And that is a positive duty. So a positive duty that is put on employers or businesses and government to take proactive steps to identify the risks in their workplace and actually start to prevent it. Put in measures to prevent the harassment before it happens and to change cultures. And so that's where we really need to go. Those recommendations, there's another 7 or so that are on the table for consultation in December. But, you know, it's kicking the can down the road sort of idea, but that's what we've got to keep pressing for. I'll just say one more point is that what I do see is positive is that the Respect at Work report really did raise awareness, and so these same laws may be used differently because people may be prepared to support others who are making claims and stand up and may believe that they will be believed in a way that they weren't before. And the other changes we've seen quite significant changes in respect to work health and safety. It has power and many businesses listen to it. And finally, I've been pushing for this, we've got the work health and safety agencies acknowledging that sexual harassment causes harm. And work health and safety laws are designed to prevent harm, right? And so they go, oh, that's part of our remit as well. So in 2021, January, we finally got guidance materials for businesses about how to identify risks, how to do something about it. So while we won't have it over here in discrimination laws, we're seeing movement in practical ways in respect to work health and safety.
Thank you. I know there's going to be questions on that coming in a few minutes. We'll go down to Yvonne. At the recent Women's Safety Summit, Professor Marcia Langton referred to the failures of the current systems and services and proposed an Indigenous-owned and led plan to end violence against Indigenous women and children. She also called out the government for not listening to Indigenous women and the very real harm being done by that omission. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened at the Women's Safety Summit and what the current national plan sets out and whether, in your view, it will be effective?
First, I'd just like to say that I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on the land of the Gadigal and also the Aboriginal people. I'd like to pay my respects to all elders, past and present, and to each and every one of you, the many nations plains that you travelled from this evening. I actually didn't participate in the summit. The way that the summit and the way the government engages with Aboriginal people, and actually all people, is not always inclusive. The way that I look at how some of these forums take place, it's not always about what they want to hear, rather actually what they want you to be told. Particularly from my perspective, Marcia has raised some significant issues, but certainly there are even more diverse and compounding issues within community. Certainly when we look at domestic and family violence, some of the key issues around how all women, but actually all people are impacted, are compounding in so many different ways. And I certainly feel that racism is not a true issue that's ever truly dealt with in this country. The fact that we have the experiences of Aboriginal people dying at the hands of not just loved ones but others as well, and those cases going unsolved in so many ways in so many places, there are big issues at play here. But Marcia has raised some significant issues. How do we address this issue, and how do we do that on an Aboriginal specific basis? And we need to be able to do that, and we need to be able to look closely at how we're doing it. From a national and more broader perspective, there are so many complexities. All of these services are underfunded. Let's face it, the issues are not really dealt with in the way that we think that they are. We know that they need to be addressed in particular ways, but they're not there yet. When we think about how this sector is not funded and isn't supported, we have a long way to go. When I think about where we're at for ourselves in addressing violence and the lack of respect of women, I mean, if you think about, maybe 20, 30 years ago, if you went to the local police station and said, my husband, brutally bashed me, or I've been raped, and the police would have said, but he's your husband. How far have we come? It's not that far. So we've got a long way to go. With that said, there are Aboriginal specific issues and there's cultural implications around that need to be dealt with. But we can't deal with our broken parts of our families in a way that is silo orientated. We need to be able to support it holistically. In terms of our family units, no matter how that composition exists, how do we look at it in a way that we are inclusive? I'm as you said, I'm counselled, and yet I have actually experienced bullying and inappropriate behaviour by fellow women, and we don't call that out. So if we've actually got these men that are doing these things, and in terms of the summit and getting achievements with this report, once it's completed and once it's fully appreciated, then we have a Prime Minister, which is a whole different conversation, don't necessarily do, because he can't even address some of these issues himself. We're not there yet. So we have, as a country, as a state and local communities, and even in our families, we have so many other difficulties that we've got to contend with. So how that's actually implemented and more broadly, from a broader perspective to a local perspective and to our own homes, where are we at? And I think that when we look at all of these directions, they can't just be about a plan that sits on a shelf and that actually is tailored to government. It needs to be tailored to individual needs, individual circumstances, and we need to be able to be adaptable enough and flexible enough to be able to implement them. So, in terms of answering your question, the proof is in the pudding. We've got to see what that looks like, but also who's going to stand up. And we've got some people that have titles, but they actually don't know what that means in terms of applying a report or living the life that we all have to live. So,
in Australia, one woman is murdered every week on average by her current or former partner. 1 in 4 women has experienced violence by an intimate partner, with 1 in 5 experiencing sexual violence. And for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women and girls, the statistics are even higher. Eleanor, can you tell us about the work that you're involved in with Bondi Beach Cottage and what support you get from the federal, state and local governments? How are services like yours impacted by the national plan?
So I just need to tell you that the chair of my board is here, and she said she'll go like this if I get too cranky. But we're really, really pissed off. The reality is that we sat through days and days of the Women's Summit. All the data was known. The information, the advocacy, it was all known and it wasn't good enough. We didn't need another bloodletting. So I just want to start out by saying we're really pissed off. But I'll try and stick to the data. I think it's really important what Belinda said about half the story being prevention, half the story being response. And there were some really big announcements today, including our watch declaring that they're going to go really hard on the prevention work and working with men. And many women's services, we realise what the problem is there and that prevention work needs to be done. But there's going to be a while as we work through this where we need to keep the funding up and really getting higher for the response work, because the more we uncover and women are free to speak, the more we're going to need to provide services with them. So that goes to what you're saying about funding. It's just a question of money. So at the moment, coming out of COVID, all the local staying home leaving violence programs, which are the state-based response, first response to women trying to get to safety, they're shut for 2 weeks. They cannot take any more women. At Bondi Cottage, we do a little bit of casework, but we're primarily domestic and family violence counsellors. We then step back and we do as much triage with people, with GPs, hospitals, to try and keep women safe. But if we can't get caseworkers to find housing and to make sure there are reasonable safety plans, women are just, and all the first responders are just going, what are we going to do with this woman? And that's not good enough. So we talk often, and we've heard the Prime Minister say, oh, I'll ask my wife for advice because she'll probably know. And we hear in fundraising all the time, it's about your sister or your daughter. It's nothing about that. It's a human right to be safe in the community. So in terms of funding, most of us are affected in domestic and family violence by state funding because it involves our police, housing, hospital system, whatever other systems I can think of. The ADVOs and work, WDBCAS is all state, but the leadership is coming from the federal government, and if they cannot keep their women safe in Parliament, what hope do we have in our homes? And it's just not good enough. I've had involvement with a lot of, not at Bondi Beach Cottage, but previously with a lot of advocates in the space. And I've had a lot of involvement with sexual assault, national and state-based organisations. I spoke to the Department of Finance when they were trying to work out how they were going to respond after Brittany Higgins. I spoke to Kate Jenkins' team, and we were looking at how women could safely talk to the Commission and be supported. And which one of those women would have made it up? Like, look what happened when Brittany put her hand up. Look what has happened to Grace. So what we want are governments that believe women, but we also want governments that believe the experts and the lived experience practitioners, because actually in a family court, I get my clients to take their notes to a GP, because even though I'm a domestic and family violence specialist with 20 years experience and a whole heap of knowledge, the GP, when they see the client for 15 minutes and doesn't do any domestic and family violence screening, her or his word would be taken over mine in a court of law as to the safety of children. Most of our funding is per client we see. Lean funding doesn't give us enough fat to grow capacity for surges like we're experiencing, but it also doesn't allow us to do any advocacy work, and in fact many NFPs, their funding agreements with state have gag clauses.
I think all of us are a little bit better with all the talking, right? We want to see action, so we'll come back to you in a few minutes with some more questions. But first of all, this year marks 100 years since Edith Cowan became Australia's first female MP. It's 30 years since Dr. Carmen Lawrence became the first female Premier, and 11 years since Australia got its first female Prime Minister, Julia Gillard. 60 years since Indigenous women were first allowed to vote in federal elections, and 55 years since they were recognised as citizens. Licia, can you tell us about your work at Women for Election in Australia, and give us some insights into whether increasing numbers of women are throwing their hats into the ring to step up for election at federal, state and local government levels around Australia?
The short answer is yes, more women are throwing their hat into the ring, and Yvonne is running right now. So I think, grab it all in 5 minutes. I ran myself in the by-election. It was one of the most positive experiences of my life. It was the exact opposite of what everybody told me it would be. And I had dozens of women come up to me in that campaign and say, keep going, you seem just like me, keep going. Watching, can I buy you a coffee at the end? Because I think I might like to do the same thing one day too, but I don't know how to start. And this whole kind of trope about women not being interested in politics is just a total furphy. But how do you get involved? So Women for Election is set up to run courses, workshops, conferences. They've all been online, as you would expect most recently. We've trained 1,900 women to run in the last 12 months. We ran 200 women to run in 2019. So, it's 800%. So it's moving Eleanor, you said about governments need to believe women and they need to listen to experts and they need to understand lived experience. I guess I've got so impatient that marching on Canberra on issues is not getting outcomes. And there's only so much you can march on Canberra on different issues and have the same faces looking back at you and giving you a pat on the head each time. Some of these issues have been 30 years long. I'm done. I'm done with that avenue. Let's change the faces. Pretend that lived I don't want to hear another report from PwC, or KPMG, or Deloitte about productivity, about what childcare should look like, about the gender pay gap. No more reports. The reports that are being presented in those tables need to be executed on. And they are only going to be executed on by people who are incentivised or have lived experience to do so. And I genuinely feel that we are at an extraordinary point right now where that realisation has come because, and the numbers at our courses are a proof statement of that. So sometimes you really have to trough out, which I think we did in Canberra in March. Really just heinous news after heinous news that made people pay attention and say, I understand now. If I don't get involved, it's not going to get better. And then I think one last thing. You're going to see us do a bit of a soft launch next week and a bit of a harder launch in the new year on rebranding power. The tropes again of power. Putin, bare-chested on a horse. Big mahogany desk. People standing in front of rockets that look like penises. These are the imagery of power as we know it. I finished doing a regional and rural tour of Australia in around April and May this year. And out in all of those communities, the women are running everything. They are keeping those communities running. They're running the business chambers, the PNC, the drought relief, the flood relief, small business, frontline services, local community campaigns. If you tap them on the shoulder and say you should run, they go, I don't have the skills to do that. I go, well, you're doing 9/10 of it right now, but you're doing it pro bono. The largest sector contributor to Australia's economy is the volunteer sector. If it stopped tomorrow, it would all fall over. So transferable, all of those leadership skills into public office. Not just transferable, absolutely needed.
I'm going to throw it over to Delia to ask you guys, if you've got questions, please stick your hand up and Delia will give you the mic and we'll get rolling.
Oh, hi there. This is a question for Yvonne and also Eleanor about just like politics at the moment in New South Wales. We've just had a female premier since January 2017, and yet there's these funding issues for women's services that are huge gaping problems. We've also got a female Lord Mayor. So how can there still be these funding problems when we've got women in charge of the state and the main CBD, city of Sydney?
Look, I think between the state and local there are significant differences. Unfortunately, what I've seen and why I put my hand up to run as Lord Mayor for this beautiful city is that we've had a female Lord Mayor, and in actual fact, the 6 candidates standing as Lord Mayor are women. There's 6 of us, and yet I have seen a lack of understanding, which is really bizarre to say, the fact that the city has never funded a crisis accommodation in its history is insulting, to say the least. I raised this as a candidate, and I think a month or so ago, council finally supported it. But apparently they already thought about it before I did. I don't know why it wasn't funded in the 17 years before now. We talk about pork barrelling and all these other things, but yet what I've seen, even in this election process for myself as not a person that's done any of your courses, still don't know what I'm doing, but I'm having a crack. That's right.
I haven't either.
That's correct. But I still don't see myself as a politician. I don't. I'm just a person that wants to make a difference. And I would think, or I believe, that someone like Clover should have. Maybe she has, and maybe she's done some great things, but has that been on her conscience, or has it been about a decision-making process of council? What I have seen in terms of council, there's been very little community support. It's been about how we can support self, right? And one of the greatest things I think needs to happen, no matter where you are, is leave the egos at the door. Because if you leave them at the door, we can have a proper conversation, we can make a difference. But we're not making those differences because people are too frightened to leave that at the door. There's some real lack of honesty that takes place, and certainly even in this election process, what I've seen take place, I'm appalled, But yet, when I look at the state government, yes, we've had a female heading our government, but how many men are there? And who holds the control of the different factions? I still can't get my head around that. I work in government myself. I work with juvenile justice, youth justice as it's now called. We've recently developed or revamped, so there was a program called My Journey, My Life, which is actually about our Aboriginal young boys that have come into the detention to support them to actually understand respect, and respect for self as well as others. And we have a respect well, and we'll talk about that. We recently had to, and my team, develop, it's called Yvonne, which is a female adaptation of My Journey, My Life, because we're getting girls that are coming through, Aboriginal young girls that are coming through the detention centre with far greater charges, like their first offences are more severe than our boys. But yet we still lock up kids from 10 years of age. What were you doing at 10 years of age? I know I wasn't doing anything that was bad enough to be locked up in there. But yet here we are. And yet we've got politicians that refuse to increase the age of detention from 10 to 14. Why? So there are so many other issues, and a lot of it comes down to funding. But the greatest issue is about power. And so no matter who you have sitting there, and I'm talking about a politician that says she's independent but really is a machinery within herself, that's held power in the local government for 17 years, in the greatest city in this country. I think we've got a long way to go. That's why you need to elect me, so if you know anyone, get her to elect me. But we've had a lot of men, but yet what I've seen take place in this great city of ours has not been supportive of women. And I think there's a vast difference there.
I'm not an economist and I'm not a political scientist. I think it's really nice to talk about power as a social worker, because that's sort of our game. But I do think it's hard to be a female politician, not every female is a feminist, and we're all products of the cultures that we're raised in. We have to navigate the power. So I leave that comment. The comment about the funding problem, it's really important that we are all informed about the levels of government and who's funding what. So as I started off, a lot of our funding that we work with in domestic and family violence is state-based. A lot of community services are council-based, local, and then the prevention work is being done nationally, and it's clunky. The way that money flows through and the accountability is really clunky, so I think that's one of the problems. But I think this is something we can all take responsibility for. We've consecutively, from back to a Labor government, we've consecutively voted in governments that are economic rationalists. We don't pay enough money and we don't give it to the right people. So, we need to elect governments who are going to collect tax and provide services. It costs a lot to do response to domestic and family violence until the prevention stuff kicks in. It could be 40 years if we're lucky.
Hi, I disclose that I'm from Voices of Wentworth, but I'm desperate to ask a question. So Licia, your focus of your organisation is really to put more women in Parliament. I'm a mother of 2 boys and I'm passionate about making changes, but I'm also recognising that I want to lead changes from my boys in terms of how they think about equity. And the thing, what I'm struggling with a little bit is, why do we need more women in politics? Why is it that men don't see that equity now? Scott Morrison is a father of 2 daughters.
I've heard.
Yeah. So a part of me is just really conflicted about, why do we need more women in politics? Why is it not that we can't just support the people that are there now? What is holding us back?
Yeah, I think we're back on the topic of power. So recognising equity would mean giving up power. That doesn't always happen. Don't always like to give up the power so easily. Certainly our focus is getting more women engaged, inspired to consider a role in public office, but to also equip them with the tangible skills to do it as well. That could be at the council level, state, or federal level, or Senate. Often when we talk about politics, we automatically go to Canberra, but that's, I try to normalise that. It's not always about that. Depends what you're passionate about. If you're passionate about public school funding, then it's state level. If you're focused about local sustainability, then it's council level. So asylum seeker reform would be federal. So I think it's not just about having more women in these chambers for women's sake. It's about the outcomes that happen when you get gender parity in those chambers. Things like greater trust, instilling greater trust. Female MPs are a lot more visible out in their electorates, the research shows. Take more constituent meetings than male MPs. Prosecute the case for their constituency back in the chamber with more frequency. And that's a positive feedback loop in terms of instilling trust in an electorate and a constituency. It inspires younger women to get involved and seeing themselves there as well. Less corruption is a key component that comes, research has shown this at the council level. Male-only councils have other councils that are currently in administration in New South Wales. Less war. More focus on policies that have greater community benefit, like public education, public health, services that we're talking about on the panel tonight as well, not just jobs and growth. And it's not that there's anything wrong with jobs and growth, it's about having that equity across a greater amount of policies. So that's a few reasons about why we want more women, more lived experience. And by the way, if I could just add there too, our role is not to help get more white women lawyers into these parliamentary chambers either. No disrespect to the white women lawyers in the room tonight. We have a sister organisation called Politics in Colour. Now that is run by women of colour, the same training courses as us, but designed to address the additional barriers that women of colour face when they run for office, and there are a number of them, and they're delivered by women of colour as well. So it's not just a lived experience as a woman, it's a lived experience of all different types that we want that diversity of thought and experience in those chambers.
I just wanted to say the question about why women, and I think it's essential to also look at our men. But unfortunately we're at a point in time that we aren't speaking the same words. they don't mean the same thing. When I spoke earlier about the impact on Aboriginal people in terms of violence and our women, some of these issues are not necessarily ingrained, but the difficulties around that is because we don't talk about this stuff. There's some real taboos that we do not discuss in our own families. You know, your families. How do we do that as a community? So if we actually don't do that within politics as well, how far do we have to go? So when we look at trying to address some of these difficulties around the power imbalance that takes place, they did that with a consultation with the voice, for Aboriginal people. So where the Laura statement of the heart came from, that was such an insulting process that I've ever seen in my entire life as an Aboriginal person. I was actually asked to go along to this over my own elders. I find that insulting, to say the least. We'll have 200 people representing half of New South Wales, and we'll have another 150 at the other half of New South Wales, and apparently that represents all Aboriginal people in New South Wales. I don't know how you ever going to get that. But then you ascend upon Uluru and we're going to come up with a statement that supposedly represents all of us. Well, there are hundreds of nations and tribes across this country. That's not good enough. But here we are. But when my mum and I went along to this event, and we actually wanted to put basically a code for anything that was put up, and whoever was going to represent us, whoever was going to put their hand up, had to be honourable. They could not have ever been convicted of an offence against a woman or a child, or any violence against any family member. We did not want anyone that was previously convicted of any sexual offences. We actually got abused by other women because we raised this as an issue. So, and I walked away and I thought, if we continue to make these issues taboo, they're going to continue to exist. And so what do we actually change? And we need to change it by having the women there. But we also, as women, need to stand up and call out the bullshit. I'm sorry, but we need to. We can't continue to stay silent. And we also have men that should know as well. And our men need to be supported, that if they actually want to call something out, we need to support them in doing that. There are some good men in politics, I tell you, and I have seen them and I have worked with them. I mean, not necessarily country, but we're struggling to, you can't have everything Kiwi when you've got the head of the country that seems to think that it's all about him and it's all about spin. But the way that we need to change politics is that we actually need to change politics, and we all need to have all of us from different walks of life, different backgrounds, different experience. And in terms of my little team that we're taking to council, we are not career politicians. We have various experiences, and all of us do. But how do we make sure that our voice is united, and how do we make sure that we actually have a voice? That's the stuff that we need to continue to push through, because it isn't about you and it isn't about me, it's about all of us together.
Clearly there is law reform that can be enacted through, for example, the Respect at Work legislation in the space of women's safety. But one of the things we struggled with a bit was, in terms of what you're asking the federal parliament to do, or even a state parliament or a local council, is it really about legislative reform, or is this more a societal issue? Is it a cultural issue? Is it an ethical issue? Is it this is such a broad-based topic, really, and there's so many aspects to it. It's not something that we see as being able to be fixed with, a piece of legislation or, a change of policy. There is a real, and that's what's fascinated us, I think, about watching what's happened this year, and people like Grace Tame, as you say, finding her voice and speaking out and actually calling to account those in power has been so powerful. And recognising that there is what we view and we hope is a real shift in terms of societal expectations of how women are treated and listened to across the board. But I'd just be interested to know what your thoughts are on what else you would suggest that the federal parliament in particular might be able to do to help address some of these problems.
I don't want to talk about it, and I won't, but we have to be careful the federal government doesn't take over, because and I don't want to talk about this, but the religious discrimination bill today is it's one of the biggest threats to our discrimination laws, for instance, that we've ever seen since they've been enacted, because it's override. We've had 40 years of a federal-state harmony, where the federal laws have been written to say these are not overriding state laws, these are working together. And this religious discrimination bill is the first time we've seen this override principles to say whatever's happened in the states, anything more progressive, we're cutting it back. So we've got to be really careful of not expecting the federal government to do it all, because we've got a federation. I might have only realised that since the pandemic, but the states actually have power and have scope, and then local council. It's this grassroots up. I've just spent 2 days in a workshop with other discrimination law experts, and one of the primary questions we were saying, what role can law play? What can we do with it? How do we do it? And one of the things I keep thinking about is there are some people who are not committed to equality and inclusion, so we've got to pressure them. So, we can get sticks and rules that make them pay attention. There's others who do care and want to do something, and so we could facilitate that, right? So have laws to facilitate it. But I certainly think one of the primary things we need is laws that promote consultation. And I don't know how to make that real, because it can be very checkboxy, right? But laws that empower and enable people, whether they're requiring businesses to consult and do it in a real way, whether it's empowering unions to be representatives, whether it's local councils or otherwise, I do think the consultation is critical to giving voice and participation. And unless we get that, what is equality? I don't know, right? Because I'm one person, a white lawyer, right? So as if I'm going to know, I'll know my own, what I've been experienced, my own lived experience, but I'm not going to be able to design a law that's going to fit everyone. And so the system, the laws, to the extent that law plays any part, has to be about empowering and enabling more voices to come through.
I think also funding those voices.
Oh, yeah,
Keep coming back to that. So, when we do run our little tea stalls in order that we can advise government, whereas, as someone's pointed out, if it was economic, someone would get paid handsomely. But I was involved in reviewing and writing a sexual harassment policy for a state political group, and they asked our opinion as trauma experts on what it should have, and I said, well, we won't consult about the legal stuff, but we will consult for women and what we see on the ground. And that was great, and they're so excited to get our sign off on it. We said, yeah, well, we're not going to do that until you put the prevention plan in. And actually they didn't do too badly with it, but the work's been done. Our watch has the prevention policy frameworks for organisations. It's been done, right? I hear what you're saying about consultation, but paying people to consult and not asking them to donate their time is really important for experts.
Yeah, and I wasn't talking about just we need to do more consultation. I agree. Did you say I agree? No, I think within every organisation they need to be compelled to consult with their workers, with their people, with their managers, and not just outsource it. Not another KPMG report or another, well, can somebody just take care of this and find us a report and give us a template and we'll now have a policy and a procedure and, she'll be dandy. Right? It's somehow, and this is where I struggle to think about what role law can play. How do you make that real consultation? How do you make them not just ask, but listen?
I also think that the investment and the shift of funding and power needs to come into play. When we think about some of those key issues and we continue to have bureaucracies that grow and governments that grow in particular ways without actually resourcing the local community that's so desperately needing the resources, I find it so insulting that we continue to build more jails and we think we're going to have different outcomes. When I first started in juvenile justice and the detention rate of Aboriginal young people was at 54%. that was 5 years ago. That's from 3% population in the state. How is that equal? Why do we accept that? And one of the first things that I was asked, when I started was like, what's my why? And I actually said, I'm here to do myself out of a job. And I got pulled aside by an executive member and said, you've got to be really mindful that you've insulted some of your colleagues. And I go, sorry, and I shouldn't be insulted that they're insulted. The fact that you want to continue to lock up these kids, all kids at the rates that we are, shouldn't that be enough to change the structure? We should be able to change, and early intervention and prevention is a key part of that. When we have these families that are struggling, or whether we've got a second or third or fourth generation that have actually been removed, or that they have actually had contact with the institution, do we expect a different outcome? Or we want to lock up their kids? I think about these kids when I go in these centres and think, well, if they're 16 now, do they have a child? Or is it going to be their child in 10 years' time? Because that's the reality of it. We have to look at intergenerational trauma, but we also need to look at how we respond from one generation to the next. We aren't changing the world that we're living in because we're making things look newer, or that because we're not changing the way that we fund. We continue to grow and we continue to look at those services and expect them to respond to these needs locally, but yet we don't have the governments that have been held accountable locally and state and federal in the same way as they expect us to in those very communities that we all live. And we see this day in and day out.
Thank you all. My name's Mick. I've got a boring-ish question about politics. How do we make this an electoral issue? It seems like after all the momentum earlier in the year, it's not being talked about as an electoral issue. How do we show up, Dave Sharma, just getting a photo with Sheila Pontos isn't enough. There are a lot of voters in our glorious seat of Wentworth who don't necessarily care about climate. They're conservative, so conservative they don't care so much about climate. They trust the Liberal Party to deal with integrity, but this issue should cut across all political.
How do we make it a federal election issue? Well, Sam Mostyn did a good crack of it yesterday at the National Press Club, and so Sam Mostyn is the chair of Chief Executive Women, and she gave a presentation yesterday in terms of the government needs to be paying attention to 51% of the population that vote. And then today there was a one-page ad in the AFR I saw that was taken out, co-signed by a number of well-known women across Australia, co-signing that gender equity is an election issue. And that will turn some heads, I suspect, as well. So I think, and then I see the next round of March for Justice protests, rallies, have been scheduled for February, 27th of February. So, and I'll tell you what, I happened to be in Canberra for the Canberra one, and it was amazing. It was only 50% amazing because it was only women marching. Really love it to be 100% amazing next time. And that is just so important. My husband, who, thankfully just left, honestly, didn't attend that with me, but I really want him to attend the one in Feb. It's going to make a difference, and I ask all the men in the room to do that as well. Turn up for those, show that it's not a 50% issue, it's a 100% issue. I think the only other piece there is that, it's time for kind of top down and bottom up. So we're going to help more people get in there to make the decisions when the evidence is, again, the next report is produced. But people need to take to the streets at the same, it's just as important. I said before, I'm sick of marching. It's not that marching isn't important. but who you're marching on is of equal importance. We don't talk about that bit as much. So, want to come to the rally?
I'll just add as well that I think the economic points are important. There's something that we can talk about. The comments from the President of the Business Council of Australia and Sam Austin was making yesterday in her address to the National Press Club about the impact that Australia suffers from the lack of engagement of women in the economy. As Licia was pointing out before, the sheer amount of the economy that relies on voluntary work from women and unpaid work and invisible work. These are issues that I think a lot of voters are becoming more aware of. And one of the other things that we're a bit concerned about with Voices of Wentworth, and we've looked at this before as well, is the media messaging around these issues. We know that Scott Morrison's very good at neutralising issues, and he's certainly made very strong attempts to do that when it comes to women's rights and women's equality. And again, I take my hat off to Grace Tate and Brittany Higgins for what they're doing there and really standing up to him and calling him out and keeping these issues in a public mind. So I think it's up to all of us to keep on doing that. And obviously we will have some very strong female candidates standing, not just independents, but across the parties as well. And I think they're going to be able to demonstrate that they will bring a lot of quality to the Parliament. So fingers crossed.
Yeah, hi, my name's Jared. I think it's really critical that inequality and poverty, try and make those top issues in the campaign with, 1.1 million people are unemployed and 60% of people on the job seeker have some sort of disability, and people know. But in recent studies, surveys have shown that in swinging seats, there's a lot of support for raising New Start and whatever. And the aspect of poverty, it's older men and older women now in particular, and particularly when the children starving because of the governments and Labor and the coalition governments in time getting to explain. Anyway, I think that's an important issue that we really need to address or try and highlight in the campaign. Of course, the government doesn't want to do it back, and I've been keen, so it's not there. On job seeker, I find well in DSP, but that was a nightmare getting that too. So anyway, I looked at the biggest site just from this electorate, and there was before COVID, there was 1,000 people on job seeker in this electorate. Now there's 2,000. But obviously poverty is post-based as well, and so that needs to be taken into account in terms of the strategies.
Yeah, thank you. Homelessness is another point there as well, which is a real problem.
For Wentworth, yes.
Yeah.
That's a problem for Wentworth. You'd be surprised in our area the extent of homelessness and women experiencing domestic and family violence, a huge inhibitor. Women are staying in their homes with the perpetrator because they can't afford to move out, and they're still having trouble getting perpetrators to move out. But also, we spoke before about the staying home leaving violence being shut to new referrals at the moment. The providers were telling me last week that 50% of their casework time is spent on the phone to homeless services, to housing. So you've got these highly skilled practitioners that are spending hours a day just trying to connect with housing. That's not even to make something happen, it's just to connect with housing. It's a big problem. Also, we've got more of a bigger called community, possibly in the domestic and family violence than we realise, and most women that are permanent residents can't get access accommodation if they're victims of domestic and family violence.
G'day, my name's Doug, and I think my question is for Belinda, because really it's kind of precipitated by the other three. Licia, you talked about getting a pat on the head when you protest about whatever, and we were just going on about how scarce resources are. Yvonne, doing what you're doing, obviously being up against it. And the resources are there. And I guess, Belinda, my question to you is, how do we sort of get to a point where, in terms of the way our politics and campaign donations and the power and the wealth are augmented and entrenched, change? And just to give everyone a dimension about that, the gas industry in Australia is Qatar is our second biggest competitor in gas. They get $25 billion a year in royalties from selling gas to the same bunch of fossil fuel companies that we sell gas to. We get about $500 million a year from them. So we're giving away about $25 billion worth of gas a year. To put a dimension on that, that is about the annual household income for the poorest 1 million households in Australia. So it's a huge amount of money. And that's one subsector, one sector, fossil fuel, of one industry, mining, where we give away a truckload of money, and then we've seen what happened with Harvey Norman and Coles and everyone getting job water and so on. So can we get the election funding back on an even keel legally, so that the other three people up on the little panel there are not so struggling for resources? The money is there. Our economy is generating the wealth, it's just where it's going.
I would like to have an answer to that one, but I'm afraid I don't know enough about the election funding rules. They're probably appalling, but not my field of expertise.
They're appalling because they're absent. I think it was one of the main stools of my campaign in 2018, election funding reform, lobbyist reform, and so forth. So yes, in terms of, and I presented on a panel about this yesterday, dark money and how Australia is woeful, like absolute, when you compare us with our equivalent nations around the world, in terms of the lack of disclosure, the lack of real-time disclosure on funding, and then not just about donations as well, the way public money is used in election campaigns, just hundreds of millions of dollars every year. And then there's the vested interests as well. So not just in terms of donations, but influence and access and backdoor and $15,000 a plate access, sit next to the minister, prosecute the case. It's not illegal. There's no rule against it. And then, but it's not just the back door, it's then the front door as well, because there's influencing there, but then there's influencing public perception, like on a super profits mining tax, for example. So happening at the back door, affecting public views out the front door as well. And I don't care whether that's pokies reform, whether it's climate reform, whether it's pharmaceutical changes, superannuation governance, funding for independent schools, goes on and on and on. And what it ends up in is policy, and what they do is influence policy outcomes for vested interest, not for the public interest. And it is exactly that. When you think, well, we need to change, we need to reform those laws then. Absolutely we do, like the UK has, and Canada has, and the EU has done. And then we go to, well, are those that have benefited from that structure incentivised to change those laws? And I would argue they're not. Who is going to be them? And now we're back to change the faces. And by the way, it's not changing all the faces, I don't think politicians are twiddling a moustache in the corner trying to work out the new... It's not about that, it's an entrenched culture issue where we now have a very shallow pool of individuals in a lot of these positions with poor skill sets and no desire to change. And, you know, I think that's what the voices of, and we're a non-partisan organisation, so I'm training someone to run for the Liberal Party at the moment, Greens, Animal Justice, Labor, the Australian Progressives, goes Nationals. But what the voices of groups have done so tremendously is re-engage the public in the political debate. And that is half the battle won. Honestly, it really is. People are now paying attention. Stuff that's going on now was going on 10 years ago, 20 years ago. That's not changed. What's changed is the public is watching now and they're not turning away. And that should give us all extraordinary hope.